Matthew 17 verse 21 has been erased from millions of Bibles, and that's not a mistake. It's not an accident. It's a deliberate removal, and the reason behind it will shake the very foundation of what you think you know about the Bible. Here's the reality: in earlier generations, this verse was a cornerstone of faith for countless Christians around the world. It reads, "But this kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting." Think about the weight of that statement. It directly connects the spiritual power to confront evil with two practices, prayer and fasting. Yet today, if you pick up a modern Bible translation, such as the NIV, the ESV, or many others, this verse is gone. Completely missing. No footnote. No explanation in most cases. Just gone. But why? To uncover this mystery, we have to go back to the origins of the biblical text itself. The New Testament was written in Greek, and the earliest surviving manuscripts are the foundation for modern translations. Key among these manuscripts are the Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, both dating to the 4th century. These texts, considered by scholars as some of the most reliable, do not include Matthew 17 verse 21. That's a fact. However, later manuscripts, like the Byzantine tradition texts and the Textus Receptus, which served as the basis for the King James Bible, do include the verse. This is where things get controversial. Scholars argue that Matthew 17 verse 21 was either added later to harmonize Matthew's Gospel with Mark 9 verse 29, a parallel passage where Jesus references prayer and fasting, or that it was removed earlier in some traditions. Let's focus on why its removal matters. Prayer and fasting are central spiritual disciplines, but removing Matthew 17 verse 21 effectively diminishes their role in combating spiritual oppression. It's no coincidence that this verse specifically targets this kind of evil, implying that some battles require a deeper level of spiritual preparation. Without this verse, the message becomes diluted, leaving many unaware of this powerful teaching. The removal also reflects deeper questions about who controls the narrative of Scripture. Modern translations often prioritize the oldest manuscripts under the assumption that earlier equals more authentic. But here's the catch: older doesn't always mean better. Many ancient manuscripts were copied by scribes under Roman control, where Christianity was becoming institutionalized. Could political or doctrinal motives have influenced which verses were preserved and which were omitted? That's not conspiracy, it's historical reality. The Roman Church of the 4th century wasn't shy about shaping doctrine to align with its growing power. But let's bring it back to the text. Why was this verse included in later manuscripts? One theory is that it reflects an oral tradition, a teaching of Jesus that wasn't in the earliest written Gospels but was passed down through the early church and eventually added to later copies. Early Christians were known for emphasizing the spiritual disciplines of prayer and fasting as essential tools in their faith. Removing a verse like Matthew 17 verse 21 could potentially strip away this foundational teaching. And don't forget, we're not just talking about one verse. Matthew 17 verse 21 is part of a larger trend in modern translations where certain verses are deemed inauthentic or less reliable based on their absence in earlier manuscripts. Other examples include John 5 verse 4 and Acts 8 verse 37. This raises an uncomfortable question: how much of what we've been taught as sacred truth has been quietly edited or erased over time? The average person sitting in church has no idea this is even happening. The Bible as we know it wasn't handed down in a single, perfect book. It was pieced together from thousands of ancient manuscripts, written and copied by hand over centuries. And that process wasn't flawless. Here's what you need to know. The earliest surviving complete New Testament manuscripts are Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, both from the 4th century. These manuscripts don't include Matthew 17 verse 21. Why? Scholars believe this could indicate that the verse wasn't part of the original Gospel of Matthew. Instead, they think it might have been added later by scribes who were harmonizing Matthew's account with the Gospel of Mark, where a similar teaching appears in Mark 9 verse 29. But the story doesn't stop there. Later manuscripts, especially those in the Byzantine tradition, do include Matthew 17 verse 21. These manuscripts became the foundation for the Textus Receptus, the Greek text used to create the King James Version of the Bible. This is why you'll find Matthew 17 verse 21 in the KJV, but not in most modern translations like the NIV or ESV. The translators of these modern versions prioritized the older manuscripts like Codex Sinaiticus, considering them closer to the original writings. The argument is this: older manuscripts are thought to be more reliable because they're closer in time to the original texts. But there's a problem with that logic. The earliest manuscripts we have were copied during a time when Christianity was under heavy Roman influence. The Roman Empire was transitioning from persecuting Christians to institutionalizing the faith. This was a period when church leaders were consolidating power and defining doctrine. It's not a stretch to suggest that some textual decisions could have been influenced by political or theological motives. Now let's talk about those Byzantine manuscripts. They represent a tradition of copying that dominated the Greek-speaking world for over 1,000 years. These scribes were meticulous, but they were also human. If Matthew 17 verse 21 was included in their manuscripts, does that mean it was part of the original gospel? Not necessarily. It could have been added later based on oral traditions or theological emphasis at the time. This brings us to an essential point: the Bible isn't a single, monolithic text. It's a collection of writings that have been preserved, copied, and translated by countless hands. Some scribes included Matthew 17 verse 21 because they believed it reflected Jesus' teachings. Others left it out, either because they didn't have it in their source text or because they considered it a later addition. One thing is clear: the presence or absence of Matthew 17 verse 21 in different manuscripts reflects the diversity and complexity of the Bible's textual history. This isn't just a simple case of one verse being removed or added. It's a window into the evolving process of how Scripture was transmitted, shaped, and standardized. And let's not forget the human factor. Every scribe who copied these texts had to make decisions. If their source manuscript included Matthew 17 verse 21, they copied it. If it didn't, they left it out. Sometimes scribes made marginal notes to clarify or expand on a passage, and over time, those notes could become part of the text itself. This is how verses like Matthew 17 verse 21 might have been added into later manuscripts. Let's talk about the King James Version. For centuries, it was considered the gold standard of English Bibles. It included Matthew 17 verse 21 without question because it relied on the Textus Receptus, a Greek text compiled in the 16th century by Erasmus of Rotterdam. Erasmus, however, didn't have access to the earliest manuscripts that we have today. His work was based on a limited number of Byzantine texts, which means his Greek New Testament included verses that were later found to be absent in older manuscripts. Fast forward to the 19th century, when scholars like Westcott and Hort revolutionized biblical studies by prioritizing the oldest available manuscripts, such as Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus. Their argument was simple: older manuscripts are closer to the originals and therefore more trustworthy. Modern translations like the NIV, ESV, and others follow this methodology, which is why they omit verses like Matthew 17 verse 21. But here's where things get contentious. Not everyone agrees that older automatically means better. Critics argue that the early manuscripts used by Westcott and Hort, and by extension, most modern translators, were not necessarily more accurate, just more fortunate to survive. These texts were preserved in dry, controlled environments like monasteries or libraries, while many Byzantine manuscripts were actively used in worship and eventually wore out. Survival doesn't guarantee authenticity, and some scholars believe the Byzantine tradition may represent a purer transmission of the text because it reflects what was widely used by early Christians. This brings us to the heart of the controversy: who decides which manuscripts are the most reliable? Translation committees are not neutral. They consist of scholars with differing theological views, interpretive preferences, and even denominational biases. The decision to include or exclude Matthew 17 verse 21 isn't just a technical one, it's ideological. By prioritizing the older manuscripts, modern translators effectively declare that the Byzantine tradition, and by extension the King James Bible, is less trustworthy. This decision has massive implications for how Scripture is understood and taught. Let's also address the role of publishing. Bible translation is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and publishers have a vested interest in creating new translations that cater to specific audiences. These commercial motivations can influence how translations are marketed and which textual decisions are emphasized. The exclusion of Matthew 17 verse 21 isn't just about academic integrity, it's also about appealing to readers who value accuracy as defined by the latest scholarship. The effects of this controversy ripple far beyond the world of biblical studies. For many Christians, the removal of Matthew 17 verse 21 feels like an attack on deeply held spiritual practices like fasting. They see it as a subtle erosion of traditional faith, a shift toward a watered-down version of Christianity that minimizes the supernatural. On the other hand, proponents of modern translations argue that they are restoring the Bible to its original form, free from later additions or theological embellishments. Matthew 17 verse 21 is a casualty of this process, but it's far from the only one. It's part of a broader pattern of changes, omissions, and additions that have shaped the text of the New Testament. Some of these changes were intentional, others accidental. Early scribes, for example, worked under challenging conditions, copying texts by hand, often in dimly lit rooms, with the ever-present risk of human error. Marginal notes meant to clarify or expand on a text could, over time, become incorporated into the body of Scripture. This is how some verses, including Matthew 17 verse 21, may have entered the text in the first place. Now, let's talk about what this tells us about the evolution of Scripture. The Bible wasn't written in a vacuum. From its inception, it was subject to the influences of the communities that preserved it. The early church wasn't a monolith. It was a diverse, often fragmented collection of believers spread across the Roman Empire and beyond. These communities had different theological emphases, different practices, and even different texts. This diversity is reflected in the variations between manuscripts. Matthew 17 verse 21, with its focus on prayer and fasting, speaks to a deeply spiritual aspect of early Christianity. The verse underscores the idea that some spiritual challenges require extraordinary measures. Whether it was added later to harmonize with Mark 9 verse 29 or omitted from earlier manuscripts because of scribal oversight, its inclusion in certain traditions highlights the importance of these practices within specific Christian communities. By removing the verse, modern translations risk erasing a piece of this historical and theological context. But the removal of Matthew 17 verse 21 also exposes a deeper issue, the question of authority. Who has the right to decide what stays in the Bible and what doesn't? For centuries, the King James Version was seen as the definitive English translation, and its inclusion of Matthew 17 verse 21 reinforced the verse's place in Christian teaching. Modern translators, however, have prioritized different criteria, such as the age and reliability of manuscripts. This shift reflects a broader move toward a more scientific approach to Scripture, but it also raises questions about how these decisions impact the faith of ordinary believers. It's not just about what's in or out, it's about the message these decisions send. Removing Matthew 17 verse 21 can be seen as a way of saying, this verse doesn't matter as much as we thought it did. For those who have relied on this verse as a cornerstone of their spiritual practice, that message can feel like a betrayal. At the same time, proponents of modern translations argue that they're restoring the Bible to its original form, free from later embellishments. Both sides of this debate highlight the complexity of balancing historical accuracy with the lived experience of faith. What does this mean for you as a reader? It means understanding that the Bible is more than a book, it's a journey. It's a collection of writings that has been shaped by thousands of years of history, shaped by the hands of countless scribes, scholars, and translators. Each verse, each word, carries with it a story, not just of what it says, but of how it came to be. Thank you for watching this video and for joining me on this deep dive into one of the Bible's most fascinating mysteries. If this sparked your curiosity, share your thoughts in the comments and let's keep the conversation going. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you won't miss the next video. See you next time.